A night that should have been ordinary turned into one of the most terrifying real-life stories you will ever hear. Imagine being pulled into a situation so dark that even the best horror movie would fail to capture the fear, the confusion, and the chilling reality of what happened. It begins quietly, with lives that appear normal on the surface, but underneath, secrets are festering, violence is building, and a tragedy is waiting to unfold. No warning, no preparation. Just a sudden plunge into something so horrifying that every witness, every investigator, and every person who hears about it is left shaken to the core. This is not just another story you can casually listen to and walk away from. This is the kind of story that stays with you long after you hear it, because it is real. The people were real, the suffering was real, and the horror that took place was not written in a script, but in blood and fear. It started with a family that looked ordinary to the outside world. Neighbors saw them as quiet, hard-working people who never gave away much about their personal lives. But behind closed doors, things were far from peaceful. Arguments had been building, anger had been simmering, and there was a constant tension that seemed ready to explode at any moment. The kind of tension you can almost feel when you walk into a room, like electricity in the air. The people inside knew something was wrong, but no one could have predicted just how far it would go. And when it finally did, the destruction was beyond imagination. That night, shadows moved through the house in silence. A sudden outburst shattered the stillness, and what followed was chaos. Screams cut through the air, the kind that make your skin crawl, because you know they come from pure terror. Walls that once echoed with laughter now echoed with fear. A single decision, a violent impulse, and a rush of uncontrollable rage turned a home into a crime scene. Every sound was amplified, the breaking of glass, the pounding of footsteps, the cries for help that went unanswered. Time seemed to slow down, trapping the victims in a nightmare that had no escape. When the first responders arrived, they could not believe what they were seeing. Hardened investigators, men and women who had seen the darkest sides of humanity, were shaken. Blood marked the walls, furniture was overturned, and the silence that hung in the air was heavier than any words could describe. The officers knew they were standing inside a story that no one would ever forget. It was not just the brutality of what had been done, but the way it seemed almost unreal, as if the line between a horror movie and real life had been completely erased. The investigation uncovered details that left everyone horrified. What seemed like sudden madness was actually a tragedy that had been building for years. Hidden abuse, quiet suffering, and unspoken fears had been buried under the surface. People had suspicions but did not speak. Friends had noticed changes but did not ask questions. And in that silence, a monster grew. The truth was worse than any rumor, worse than any suspicion. It was not just one moment of rage. It was a history of cruelty finally breaking into the open in the most violent way possible. Even now, when people hear this story, they shiver, not because it is distant or fictional, but because it is uncomfortably real. It makes you wonder how many other homes carry silent secrets, how many other families are living on the edge of tragedy. It makes you think about the masks people wear every day, pretending everything is fine when in reality, horror is brewing just beneath the surface. That is why this story is more terrifying than any movie. You cannot pause it. You cannot remind yourself it is just acting, because it is not. This happened. Real people suffered. Real lives were destroyed. And the darkness that caused it was not supernatural. It was human. This is the story that gives you chills because it forces you to look at reality without filters. A reality where evil does not come from haunted houses or cursed objects, but from people. People who can smile at you in the morning and become monsters by night. The story only grew darker as investigators began piecing together what really happened inside that house. Each photograph taken at the scene revealed a detail more disturbing than the last. The floor was marked by violent struggle, the kind where every corner of the room told a story of desperation. Forensic experts studied broken furniture, blood patterns, and scattered objects to reconstruct the moments that unfolded. What they found painted a picture of calculated cruelty. It was not a sudden act with no thought. It carried signs of intent, of choices made step by step with chilling precision. That realization shook everyone involved, because it meant the terror was not accidental, it was deliberate. Neighbors, who had always thought of the family as quiet, were left reeling when police knocked on their doors to ask questions. They remembered hearing strange noises that night, but no one could have guessed the horror behind those walls. Some admitted they had occasionally heard shouting before, muffled arguments that went on longer than they should have. But like most people, they dismissed it as private matters. Now those same neighbors lived with regret, haunted by the idea that maybe, just maybe, if they had spoken up earlier, things might have been different. That guilt is something they still carry, a silent weight that never truly leaves. The surviving evidence revealed the fear of the victims in those final moments. They tried to escape, tried to fight, tried to survive. The overturned chairs, the claw-like marks on the door. Even the broken lock spoke of a desperate attempt to get away. But the violence was overwhelming. It consumed the entire house in minutes, leaving nothing untouched. Each room held its own silent testimony. Unfinished meals left on the table, personal belongings scattered as if frozen in time, and the eerie quiet after chaos. As detectives worked, they began uncovering the deeper truth. The years of hidden abuse that no one outside the family truly knew. Friends recalled that sometimes the victims seemed withdrawn, quieter than before, but no one pressed for answers. Some co-workers remembered excuses for bruises, stories that never quite made sense, but were never challenged. Slowly, a pattern emerged, one that pointed to a cycle of control, fear, and silence that had been tightening its grip for years. That is why the final explosion of violence was so brutal. It was the breaking point of years of torment. The press quickly picked up the story, splashing it across headlines and TV screens. Audiences were horrified, drawn to the shocking details, but also unsettled by how close to home it all felt. This was not a faraway tale. It could have been anyone's street, anyone's neighbor, anyone's friend. The media portrayed the case as one of the most chilling crimes in recent memory, not only for the brutality, but for the way it revealed how easily darkness can hide in plain sight. Families across the city began questioning the secrets within their own communities, and many wondered how much suffering goes unnoticed behind closed doors. Court proceedings brought another wave of horror. As prosecutors laid out their evidence, the full picture became clear. Chilling testimonies described the manipulation, the threats, and the terrifying control that built up to that fatal night. Every new detail pulled the public deeper into shock. It was not just the act itself, but the coldness behind it that horrified people most. Witnesses described expressions with no remorse, actions carried out as if life meant nothing. That lack of humanity was perhaps the scariest part of all, because it proved that the monster was not a creature from nightmares, but a person who lived among others unnoticed. When the jury listened to the final recordings and saw the photographs, many wept openly. Hardened lawyers and seasoned officers admitted they had never encountered a case that chilled them quite like this one. The haunting part was the realization that this story was not unique. It was a reminder of countless unseen tragedies happening quietly in silence, waiting to erupt. And once again, the line between real life and horror fiction blurred until it was impossible to separate them. The trial ended with justice being served, but no verdict could undo what happened. Families of the victims were left with grief that would last a lifetime. Every anniversary of that night brought fresh pain, and every new detail that surfaced reopened old wounds. The story was etched not only into police records, but also into the collective memory of a community that would never see its neighborhood the same way again. Even years later, the house stood as a chilling reminder. Some refused to walk past it, calling it cursed, while others stopped to stare, unable to believe that such horror could take place in such an ordinary-looking home. But that is the point of this story. Evil does not announce itself with thunder or warning. It hides, it waits, and it strikes when you least expect it. That is why this true crime tale still sends shivers down the spine, because it forces us to confront the darkest truth. Monsters are not born in myths, they are made in reality. The courtroom may have closed, but the echoes of this story refuse to die out. After the verdict, journalists, investigators, and even psychologists began to dig deeper, trying to answer the questions that no one could shake off. How could such horror exist inside an ordinary home without anyone noticing? How does someone live in plain sight while hiding cruelty of this magnitude? Those questions became the center of endless discussions, because the answers pointed to something unsettling. Evil is often invisible until it erupts. In the aftermath, survivors and relatives of the victims struggled to put their lives back together. For them, justice offered little comfort. The scars left behind were not only physical but emotional, cutting into their daily lives in ways no one else could fully understand. They could not enter a room without replaying the sounds of that night in their heads. They could not close their eyes without seeing the images that haunted their dreams. Some moved away entirely, unable to walk the same streets or face the same neighbors who once ignored the warning signs. Others stayed, determined to live on in memory of the ones they lost. But even then, the weight of trauma never loosened its grip. The house itself became a symbol. At first, it was sealed with police tape, windows boarded up, furniture inside left frozen in time. Curious strangers came by, staring at it as if it were part of a ghost story. Some whispered rumors about strange sounds. Others swore they saw shadows moving inside even when it was empty. But the truth was that the real haunting came not from spirits, but from the knowledge of what had happened there. The ordinary walls of that house had absorbed years of pain, and when the final violence exploded, it left an atmosphere that no fresh paint could ever erase. As the case remained in the public eye, more disturbing details surfaced. Investigators revealed hidden journals, photographs, and recordings that exposed the psychological warfare that had been taking place for years. The victims were not only physically harmed, but mentally broken down, piece by piece, until their world shrank into one of fear and control. Experts explained how abusers operate in cycles: love one moment, cruelty the next, trapping victims in confusion and dependency. It was a chilling reminder of how easy it is for someone to manipulate those closest to them, and how hard it is for the victims to break free. The media could not resist portraying the story in the most dramatic light possible. Documentaries, articles, and even podcasts explored every corner of the case. They interviewed neighbors who expressed regret, officers who shared their shock, and psychologists who explained the deep psychological scars left behind. Viewers and listeners everywhere were horrified, but also drawn in, because deep down, people wanted to understand how such evil could grow unnoticed. Yet even with all the analysis, one truth stood out above all: nothing could fully explain the darkness that drove this crime. The broader impact of the story spread far beyond the family and community. Support groups formed for victims of domestic abuse, inspired by the tragedy to speak out and demand change. Lawmakers debated new protections, arguing that silence enables violence to grow unchecked. Teachers and employers began receiving training to recognize the hidden signs of abuse, hoping to prevent another tragedy before it erupted. In this way, the story became both a scar and a warning, a reminder that ignoring small signals can lead to devastating outcomes. But for those who lived through it, the warning came too late. Survivors spoke in court about the sound of cries that were never answered, about the fear that wrapped around them like chains, and about the moment when everything they loved was ripped away. Their testimonies brought audiences to tears, because they were not dramatic speeches written for a film. They were raw, broken voices describing real suffering. Years passed, but the memory did not fade. On anniversaries of the crime, the community gathered in silence, lighting candles and standing shoulder to shoulder, trying to reclaim some sense of peace. Yet even in those moments of unity, there was an unspoken understanding that no gathering, no prayer, and no words could erase the images of that night. The story remained carved into the minds of everyone who heard it, lingering like a shadow that refuses to disappear. And that is what makes this crime so terrifying. It is not only the violence itself, but also the way it forces us to face the reality that evil can exist anywhere, behind a smile, behind a door, in a family that looks perfectly normal from the outside. This was not a story created for the screen. It was not a script carefully crafted to entertain. It was raw, brutal, and true. And that truth is why even today, when people speak of it, their voices lower, their faces pale, and a chill runs through their veins. The more the story spread, the more it began to feel less like a crime case and more like a mirror held up to society. People started to ask themselves uncomfortable questions. How many times had they looked away when something seemed wrong? How many times had they dismissed cries for help as personal drama? The truth of this tragedy was that it did not just happen overnight. It grew silently, fed by fear, secrecy, and the unwillingness of outsiders to intervene. That realization left an entire community haunted, because they knew the horror might have been stopped if someone had acted sooner. For psychologists and criminologists, this case became a study in human behavior. They looked at the patterns of manipulation, the way fear silences victims, and the way communities often ignore danger signs because acknowledging them feels too heavy. One expert explained that abuse thrives in secrecy, and every time a neighbor, friend, or co-worker chooses silence, the abuser grows stronger. The case revealed exactly that: a family trapped not just by violence, but by the invisible walls built from shame and denial. These findings were published in journals, taught in universities, and used in training programs for law enforcement. The hope was that maybe, just maybe, others would learn before it was too late. Meanwhile, survivors wrestled with guilt that was never truly theirs to carry. They questioned every choice they had made, every moment they had stayed silent or failed to escape. But what outsiders rarely understood was how carefully abusers trapped their victims. Promises of change, threats of worse consequences, and constant control all blend into a prison with no visible bars. For survivors, the hardest part was not just surviving the night of terror, but surviving the memories that followed. Even years later, nightmares replayed the screams, flashbacks stole their peace, and trust in people became almost impossible. Journalists kept the story alive by revisiting it on anniversaries. Each year, headlines reminded the public of what had happened. Documentaries replayed interviews with investigators, survivors, and neighbors. Each retelling brought back the fear and the fascination because people could not look away. It was too horrifying yet too real to ignore. Audiences sat in disbelief, whispering to themselves that this could never happen in their own homes. But deep down, they knew that was exactly what made it terrifying. It could happen anywhere, to anyone. Some tried to move on by erasing the memory of the house itself. There were talks of tearing it down, of replacing it with something new so that the shadow would no longer loom over the street. But others argued that the house should remain as a reminder, a warning carved into bricks and walls. In the end, time did not erase the atmosphere. Whether standing or gone, the house had already turned into a symbol of horror, and people continued to speak of it in hushed tones as if it were cursed. The trial transcripts, recordings, and evidence eventually became public records, and those who studied them were struck by one common theme: the absence of humanity in the actions of the perpetrator. Coldness replaced compassion. Control replaced love, and rage replaced reason. It was a transformation that proved evil does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it grows quietly inside someone who looks like everyone else. That was the part that unsettled people most. You could pass someone like this in the grocery store, exchange polite greetings, and never know the darkness they carry. Support groups formed in the aftermath, not only for those directly affected, but for others who had lived through similar hidden abuse. For the first time, many found the courage to speak openly, realizing they were not alone. This movement saved lives, because silence had once allowed tragedy, but voices now carried warnings that could not be ignored. Campaigns spread across schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods, urging people to notice the signs and to act before it was too late. Still, despite all the efforts to find meaning, the horror of that night remained inescapable. Families broken, lives lost, innocence destroyed. No education or awareness could undo what was already carved into history. That is why the story carried weight far beyond the courtroom. It was not just about punishment, it was about a lesson written in blood and grief. Every retelling ends with the same chilling truth. This was not fiction. It was not written for shock value or entertainment. It happened in real life, to real people, in a home that once looked no different from yours or mine. And that is what makes it unforgettable. Movies can scare you for a night, but this story scares you for life because it proves the darkness is real, and it might be closer than you think. Even after years had passed, the story never truly faded. It was retold in living rooms, classrooms, and court lectures, always with the same quiet unease. People leaned in close to listen, not because they wanted to be entertained, but because they needed to understand how something so unimaginable could happen in a world that felt ordinary. Every retelling carried the weight of grief, of fear, and of a lesson that no one wanted to face. Evil is not a stranger lurking in the dark. It can be someone who shares your roof, your street, or your trust. That truth made the story live on far longer than the events themselves. Families of the victims carried the heaviest burden. No justice system, no punishment, no public outrage could bring back what was taken from them. Birthdays became reminders of absence, holidays became hollow, and photographs became painful echoes of moments that would never return. Some relatives spoke out publicly, hoping to turn their pain into prevention. They appeared in interviews, urging others to listen to the warning signs, to never dismiss the quiet cries of those trapped in fear. Others stayed silent, unable to bear the public gaze, choosing instead to mourn in private. Both paths carried equal weight, because grief is not something that fades, it is something you learn to live beside. The neighborhood too was scarred. Once a quiet street where children played and neighbors exchanged greetings, it now carried an invisible shadow. People who lived nearby admitted they never felt the same peace again. Some moved away, unable to look at the house without chills. Others stayed but carried an unspoken fear. always wondering if another hidden tragedy might be brewing behind another closed door. The sense of safety was gone, replaced by the unsettling realization that you never really know what happens inside someone else's home. Over time, the story became a case study in documentaries, books, and crime shows. Experts analyzed every decision, every piece of evidence, and every detail of the abuse that led to the final night of terror. Each analysis carried the same message: tragedies like this rarely erupt from nowhere. They grow quietly, invisibly, and are often surrounded by silence. That silence is what makes them deadly. People began using the story as a reminder to check in on friends, to ask hard questions, and to act when something felt wrong. If there was any light to be found in the darkness, it was the awareness that grew from the horror. Yet no amount of analysis could erase the raw images. For the officers who first walked into that house, the scene was burned into memory. For the neighbors who heard the screams, the guilt of not acting stayed heavy. For the survivors, the trauma lived on in every dream and every shadow. And for the world that heard the story, the shiver down the spine remained, because the line between safety and horror felt thinner than ever. This is why the story is more chilling than any film. A movie ends when the credits roll. The fear disappears when the lights come on, but real life does not offer that escape. The house, the memories, and the pain remain long after the headlines fade. The truth does not end with a final scene. It lingers, reminding everyone that the world can be far darker than fiction. And so, when people say no movie can top this story, they are right, because films are built from imagination, while this tragedy was built from reality. Reality does not need exaggeration. It is already terrifying enough. The screams were real. The suffering was real, the silence of the neighbors was real, and the darkness that caused it all was as human as it could get. This story gives you chills not because it is about ghosts or monsters from another world, but because it shows you the monsters that exist in ours. It forces you to confront a truth most people try to ignore. Danger does not always come with warning signs. Sometimes it comes quietly, dressed in familiarity, waiting until it is too late. That is why this true crime documentary will forever stand apart. It is not a tale you can walk away from. It is a scar on reality, and scars never fade. The weight of this story leaves a silence that words can barely fill. What happened inside that house was more than just a crime. It was a revelation of how fragile safety truly is, how quickly ordinary life can shatter into something unrecognizable. It is a reminder that behind the walls of any home, there may be struggles no one sees, fears no one hears, and cries no one answers. That truth is what makes this story unforgettable, because it forces us to face what we often choose to ignore. For investigators, the memory remains etched forever, a case that pushed them beyond the limits of their endurance. For families, it is a wound that never heals, a chapter they never asked for but must live with every single day. For the community, it is a constant lesson in vigilance, an understanding that silence can cost lives, and that speaking up can sometimes make the difference between survival and tragedy. This is not just another story for entertainment. It is a warning, a mirror, and a scar. A warning that tells us monsters are not born from myths. They walk among us. A mirror that shows us how easily danger hides in plain sight. And a scar that proves once evil is unleashed, it leaves a mark that never truly fades. So when we say that no movie can top this story, it is not exaggeration. It is the reality that fiction tries and fails to capture. Because nothing can compare to the horror of knowing that this happened, that it could happen again, and that the only way to stop such darkness is to face it, speak about it, and never let silence win. And that is why this story will always give you chills. Because unlike a film, you cannot turn it off, you cannot walk away, and you cannot forget it. It is real, it happened, and the echoes of it will forever remain.